Hello and welcome to Little Rock Original Free Will Baptist Church. We're so glad to have you today, and I'm Jerry Godwin, and you and I will be sharing the Sunday School lesson for today, which is entitled In Wisdom and Stature. It's taken from the book of Samuel and the book of Luke. And as I was studying this lesson, I have come to the conclusion that I don't know who the lesson is about. It's about Samuel, and it's about Jesus, but it's also about the parents. And then I began to wonder over the last couple of days, is it really about me? As a parent, as a leader in the church? I'll let you come to the conclusion when we finish. But many of us have been in the situation that we are expected to be a good example to a child. Well, I try to be, but I have to confess that I'm a bit of a prankster. I like to make people laugh, adults and children. And I'll never forget in this church, outside when we leave the church, when we meet outside, and this child came up to me and other, quote, adults, and the child said something to her father, and he said, "Where did you hear that?" And he said, "I heard Mr. Jerry say it." And it wasn't anything inappropriate, except for the fact that I was just saying it to be funny. And over the years, I've had people to pick up Jerry-isms. And so you have to be careful, little mouth, what you say. Be careful, little feet, where you go. Because we all are responsible for the nourishment of the children in our church. And let that simmer for a while. Well, the first story we have today is from 1 Samuel, beginning in verse 2. But once again, that's jumping ahead of the story. There was a man named Elkanah, and he had a wife named Hannah, and he had another wife named Peninnah. Now, Peninnah had several children by her husband, but Hannah was barren. As she was getting older, she was really barren. And Peninnah and the other women in the neighborhood used to like to tease her and about not being able to have a baby. So they would laugh and call her names, and they wouldn't let her join in any woman auxiliary games. So that she was fit to be tied. And some of you know, as my wife and I did, to some people how difficult it is to have a child. You think it's just going to be the easiest thing in the world, and the sadness and depression that comes from the inability to have a child. So when Elkanah, her husband, and she would go to Shiloh, she would, for religious services, she would always pray for a child. And one time when she went, she prayed that if I can just have a boy, I will dedicate him to the service of the Lord. Well, the priest named Eli heard her praying, and he thought she was crazy, even to the point of being drunk. And she said, "No, I'm not drunk. I'm in my right mind, and I want a child a boy child that I can dedicate to the service of the Lord. Well, now we have beginning in verse 2, and as I want to intercede here and say, please subscribe to these videos. There's a little bell there that you can press and subscribe, and you'll get weekly updates. We want more and more subscribers, and you can share with other people. So Samuel was ministering before the Lord. Hannah had a child, a boy child, and she named him Samuel, which means the Lord, as in El, like Elohim, and she took him and presented him to Eli the priest, and wanted him to raise him in the temple to serve the Lord. Now the question I have, Eli had two sons, Hophni, Phinehas, or Phineas, and it says in the Bible that they were scoundrels and they were evil. Now I'm wondering if Hannah and Elkanah thought, we don't really want him raising our child, but he was a man of God, and so they did. And they went back on their annual visit for the religious service, and there Samuel was ministering before the Lord. A boy wearing a linen ephod. Well, an ephod is like an apron, and you can look it up in a dictionary and find out what it looks like. Now, a linen ephod was not ornate like the priest normally wore, but it identified Samuel as one that was leaning toward the priesthood. And his mother used to make for him a little robe, and I want to say a widow robe, but I'm not going to say that, okay? But she would make for him every year a widow robe because he would outgrow his robe. And so she was always keeping him properly dressed, and would take it to him each year when she went with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. And then Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife Hannah and say, "May the Lord repay you with children by this woman for the loan that she made to the Lord." He was aware, of course, that she had left Samuel with him for his training, and he remembers her prayer, and he prays for her to be blessed with more children. Well, in fact, Hannah had 3 more sons and 2 daughters. And then the woman's auxiliary let her play in their games. So she was in good standing for the rest of her life. And then they would return to their home. And it says in verse 26, "Now the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and his people." Now, first he grew in stature, which would be his height and size. He grew up to be a man. And by the way, he was 12 years old, and a boy became a man at 13, and they would have what they call in the Jewish religion a bar mitzvah, which they would be vowed to take the commandments, and you were not allowed, you were not required to go to these services. You could go with your parents, but as a boy of 13, you were required to go. And then it says that he also grew in knowledge and in maturity. Now, I've grown a lot in knowledge. I'm not sure how much I've grown in maturity, although someone told me one time that mature means overripe, almost rotten, so I might be more mature than I was when I was 13. Hopefully I am. And then he grew in favor of the Lord. Here he was under the great leadership of the priest Eli. And this is a sidelight, no extra charge. My middle name actually is Eli, and I'm proud of it. It has the religious connotations here. So he grew in favor of the Lord in a spiritual dimension, and his relationship with God grew each year. So finally, Samuel grows in favor with the people. There's the social dimension of his life. And I think sometimes we all forget our social responsibilities. We come to church to worship corporately, together. And I know everyone is not as extroverted as I am, and I have trouble understanding introverts just like they have trouble understanding me. But one of the things I urge you to do when you are in a worship service with others is please speak to others that you don't know and welcome them to your worship service and find out some things about them and share things with others about yourself that I didn't grow up. I know a lot more now than I knew when I was a child. I know a lot more now than when I was a child. And you don't know where they are in their faith journey. And that we should be there for them for the glory of God and for the strengthening of our church. I'm just beginning to understand a lot of that because we're having more and more people that are coming into our church and how important that is. Now, how did this turn out? Samuel grew up to be a priest. He grew up to be, it says, the first prophet in the nation of Israel. And he also grew up to be the last judge of Israel before Israel wanted a king because they wanted to be like other nations. So God granted that, and the first king was King Saul, who was a good king for a while and then not so good king. And then David, the shepherd boy, came in and became the king after King Saul. And Samuel was over the leadership of all that and was truly a man of God. And I think he died around 90 years old. So Samuel was raised in the church, in the temple, by religious people, by a devout mother and father, and I submit to you by other leaders of the church and friends. He probably may not have had much to do with other children at the time that he began, but he grew up to be, and consistent with his name, he grew up to be a man of God. And then we have in the New Testament, in the book of Luke, we have the story of this child. You may have heard of him. His name was Jesus. Now, Mary wasn't looking to have a baby. She was just a young girl herself. And an angel came to her and said that you are chosen among women to bear the Son of God. And Hannah presented a song, if you look in the book of Samuel, glorifying God, and it's similar. Mary offers one that's called the Magnificat, praising God's name. Well, the story in today's lesson is the only biblical documentation of Jesus past his birth, between then and when he became his ministry, when he was 30 years of age. Here he is 12 years of age, and every year, beginning in verse 41, every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. They were required to go every year. Now, it was 90 miles from Nazareth to Bethlehem. I did some research. This is Lucama, Lucama, North Carolina, and it's 90 miles to Lumberton, which is near the South Carolina border. It's 90 miles to Pinehurst, where you may have heard of in the U.S. Open golf, and it's 90 miles to Swan Quarter. Now, that may or may not mean anything to you. The key thing may be the 90 miles. What if you had to walk 90 miles to the Passover? And not only that, Jerusalem was higher in altitude than Nazareth was, so they had to walk 90 miles. Well, technically, only Joseph, being the man, was required to go. If you lived within a certain number of miles, you were required to go every year. A little bit further, you're only required to go, I think, like once in a lifetime, or as often as you could. Now, Jesus was 12 years old, and technically, he was not required to go, but they took him with them. And they went up to, as usual, so they normally attended, for the festival. Now, if you remember, the Passover was a celebration in the Old Testament when God told the Israelites, as they were in bondage, to put the blood of the lamb on their doors, to show that they were part of the Jewish nation. And the Passover angel came, and they passed over them if they showed the blood of the lamb And when the festival was ended and they started to return, going back the 90 miles, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents were unaware of this. Now, I'm sure many of you have experienced this, along with my wife and myself. If you've ever lost your child, there is nothing any more frightening than losing your child. We lost our child in a department store. I've known people that have lost their child at the beach and at a theme park. Can you imagine losing them in a theme park or on the sandy beach with all that noise and all that those people? Now, they assumed that he was with a group of travelers and they had been gone a day's journey. Now, usually, a 13-plus-year-old boy would be with the men, and someone below 13, which Jesus was, would be with the women and the family. But they looked around and they're going, uh-oh, where is Jesus? Then they started to look among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. There were still a lot of people in Jerusalem. Where do you look for a 12-year-old boy? Can you imagine the fear? And I don't know if Mary did this or not, but I know what my mother or daddy would have done if they had lost me. Of course, you know what? I've got to be honest. It was kind of hard to lose me. There's a lot of people probably want to lose me over the years, but anyway, they looked for Jesus. They looked for 3 days, and they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Now, I'll wonder all the rest of my life, and how long that is, what was Jesus saying to these teachers? You know, I love Sunday school. I love the study of the Word. Can you imagine Jesus sitting there among men and asking these questions and learning? Now, apparently, he had been taught many things already by Joseph and perhaps Mary. And here he had this deep desire to learn more. And as they were teaching him, he was asking them questions. Now, the teachers of the law knew the law. All good Jewish men knew the law. But these teachers knew it to the nth degree. What kind of questions and what kind of explanation could Jesus give to the teachers? But it says all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers, Jesus' answers. Now, there's a myriad of things he could ask, but I know that the teachers could say, love God with all your heart. And Jesus says, what does that mean to you? It's easy for you to say. What does that mean? Does that mean that I should also love my neighbor as I love myself? Does that also mean that I should love my enemies? Does that mean that I should love everyone? And I can just see them going, and then Jesus would ask them something. It's okay for healing to take place on the Sabbath. And they're saying, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. He said, you mean if I lose a sheep and I can't rescue that sheep? You mean if my brother or sister in Christ is sick, I can't get help for them? In verse 48 it says, when the parents saw him, they were astonished. Now listen, Mary says, child, why have you treated us like this? They were worried about the embarrassment that he had caused. They were worried that he wasn't where he was, quote, supposed to be. She says, your father and I have been anxiously looking for you. And he said to them, why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? I think this is a transitional statement. We know that Joseph took responsibility of being his earthly father, but I think Jesus was speaking profound words by saying, I had to be with my Father, with God. But they didn't understand what he was saying. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. And his mother treasured all the things in her heart. You noticed that he abided by the commandment, honor your father and mother. So he went back home with them. And it says he was obedient to them. And you know, when you have a child and you're mad with them or upset with them, and they come back to you and give you a hug, it's all forgiven. And Mary once again pondered these things in her heart, that what did he mean by he had to be about his Father's business? And like the story of Samuel, akin to that, Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor. Jesus indeed did grow in favor with God and the world, and he was obedient. It said he must be about his Father's house, but he must go to the cross. He must give his life, and he must be raised again, and he must go to his Father's house in heaven. And that's, my friend, what he did for you and I, for you and me. Praise be to God. Praise be to Jesus Christ, who lived a life in obedience to God the Father and to do his will. May we do likewise, to be obedient to God and be obedient to his will for us in our lives. To God be the glory. Amen.